let's start with 10. Now the output of useState is an array. So let's go and get that array. And within that array, the first item is the current value of that piece of state. And let's take a look, see what it looks like. All right, so we've got a button down here, kind of hard to see a little bit, but it's got 10 on it, but it doesn't do anything yet. So we want to create an onClick. So how do we do that? We'll use onClick, and then we give it a function. So we're going to say add1 is our function, and then we'll define that.
गोडसे पर लगाए गए हैं कई आरोप। गांधी की हत्या कर दी और गोडसे की आवाज को दबा दिया गया। समय ने उन्हें अपनी बात कहने का मौका नहीं दिया। ये फिल्म दे रही है। आमने सामने है गांधी और गोडसे और उनके बीच होता है विचारों का युद्ध।
अगर इस संसार को बचाना है, मानवता को बचाना है, तो हिंसा को, हर तरह की हिंसा को छोड़ना होगा।
आपके पास एक बहुत खतरनाक हथियार है, आमरण अनशन, जिसका बार बार इस्तेमाल करके आप लोगों से अपनी बात मनवाते हैं। ये भी एक प्रकार की हिंसा है, मानसिक हिंसा।
That function. So here's a mistake that I've seen people do. I've seen people do count plus plus. And I think the idea is that, well, count is just a count, and when I set it, it should be retained. So let's try that out. Let's see if that actually works. So I hit click on that, nothing happens. And so why is that? Well, we're seeing that we're getting this assignment to a constant variable. Now, what's outputting that is actually Console Ninja. You want to go grab that. That's from the folks at Wallaby. The link to that also in the description down below. It's free. And it's super handy like this. So, well, okay, we get it. This is defined as a const, right? So let's go and redefine that as a let, and maybe that will work. All right, let's give it a try. Now I click, still doesn't work, but we don't get an error. Interesting. Okay, so why is this? Well, learning why this is really critical to understanding pretty much all of state management in React. So I want to spend a bit of time on it. And one of the things I want to do is I want to use a workbook to show how this is actually working. So I'm going to go create in another extension called Quokka, a worksheet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function that returns a value, kind of like useState. So we'll call that function getState. And let's say that it has some value in it, say 42. Now down here, I'm going to call getState. Now currently it just returns 42, but I'm going to go store that somewhere. So I need to store that in a new value. So like my value. And we'll just ask Quokka what my value is. It's 42. And now if I set it to something else, now my value is 22. Cool. But what happens when I go and get the state again? So I'll say my value again. And now my value again is still 42, because setting the value of a return just sets your local copy. So scalars, and that includes strings, numbers, and booleans, so a number in this case, are returned and passed by value, where arrays and objects are passed and returned by reference. And there's a huge difference there. So when you're returned something by value, you don't get it, you get a copy of it, which is not the same thing. Now you could say, oh, Jack, you got it all wrong. This is returning an array. Okay, fine. Go try the same thing with an array. There you go. So we see that again, my value is 42. We set the local copy to 22, and then we again set that, and there's no difference. Same sort of thing down here, right? All we're doing is just destruct get the or whatever. And the count is associated with this particular instance of this component, but this component is the app, right? So we only have one. So what if we were to have multiple ones of these? Let's go and take app and just rename it counter. And then we'll make a new app that'll just make a bunch of counters and see how that works. Now we have one counter down here. Let's go make a bunch. Cool. Now we've got 4 count buttons, and now we can click on each one of them, and they all independently set. And that's what I mean by the state being coupled with the instance of that component. Each one of these components, these counter components, maintains its own count. And thus, going back over here, we can go and independently mutate each one of these, and they all maintain their states individually. So we talked about how to manage a scalar, a simple scalar using useState. Let's talk about how to manage an array. So we do that a lot as well. So I'm going to create an array of names, and then we're going to have an ability to add a name to that. So let's get rid of old name list, Jill and John. And now we're going to name, be able to add Let's go and actually put it into our app. Nice, and let's go and actually put it into our app. All right. Name as a now when this text changes, we get an event. event. And that event has a value for the current target, the target of that event being that input or the last state. Again, we're using the setter, right? Numbers and booleans. That's all the name. So now we've got our set. Let's go to so we can that is going to respond to the list. So now we've got our set. Let's go take a look and see if that works. Seems to work pretty well. Cool. Now we need to add a click handler that is going to respond to clicking on add name to add that name to that list. Okay, so here we have the name onto list. All right, let's go check this out. I'm going to go and add some just random text in there. I'll hit add name and nothing happened. The name field. So if I hit backspace, that's going to change the state of the name field, which calls set name. Set name then does two things. It sets the name and it also enqueues a re-render request for this particular re-render. So if I hit in there, I'll hit add name and nothing happens. But here's an interesting deal. If I change the state of the component, we'll get a re-render. So if I hit backspace, that's going to change the state of the name field, which calls set name. Set name then does two things. It sets the name and it also enqueues a re-render request for this particular component. When the re-render happens, we get that same list and then we print it out. Now that's the big difference here between scalars and references. So strings, numbers, and booleans are scalars. You get back the value, a copy of the value, and then that's it. You got the local copy. But when it comes to objects and arrays, JavaScript manages those by reference. And when you give React a reference to this particular array, it then holds not the array data itself, but it holds a reference to that array. And then it gives us back that same array reference. We then use an in-place command, push, to mutate that data of that array in place. And that's why, as we add more items, when we do a refresh, we actually get that updated data. The problem is that React has no idea that we've done that. So the second part of what a setter does, which is to enqueue a request for a re-render of the component, doesn't happen. So what if we did this? What if we said set list and we'll just give the same list again? I mean, hey, we've made a change. We should, just go and re-render. Okay, let's try that. So hit refresh, add the name again, and nothing happens. So here's the deal. When I call any setter, when it comes to use state, it looks at the old value and it looks at the new value. And if the old value and new value are the same, it just says, I don't care. Thanks, but you're not really doing anything. So what we're doing in this case is we are giving it back exactly the same reference as we had before. So it's looking at those two references and saying, oh, that's the same array. And so you're just asking me to do nothing really. And so it doesn't enqueue a re-render request. So what we need to do in order to make this work is instead of in place mutating the array, we create a new array that has the contents of the old array plus the new name. So the way we do that is we create a new array. We give it all of the old array, so list in this case, and then we give it our new name. Now we don't have to do that push anymore. Hit save, and away we go. Even better, we can do set name and set that to an empty string. Then after we add it, that's set to an empty string. And it's important to know that with React 17, with React 18, these setters are batched. So you do set list, it sets that value, it enqueues a request, set name runs right after that, sets that name, again, enqueues a request to re-render the component. React says, hey, I've already got one for this component, and it just ignores it. And then when the re-render comes around, both of those values, after we add it, that's set to an empty string. And it's important to know that with React 17, with React 18, these setters are batched. So you do set list, it sets that value, it enqueues a request, set name runs right after that, sets that name, again, enqueues a request to re-render the component. React says, hey, I've already got one for this component, and it just ignores it. And then when the re-render comes around, both of those values have been set. Now, the last thing I want to cover about useState before we move on to useReducer is that useState also can take a function as a starting point. So let's just take our example here of a simple string, and then we'll give it a function. And that function will return a string that says Jack. And there you go. Now it's initialized to Jack. So the value of doing it this way is that if you've got some sort of complex calculation that you need in the creation of this use state, you can do it all within that function, and that function will guaranteed only ever get run once when that component is first created. Let's continue to take a look at native state management in React by taking a look at use reducer, which is another way to store state in connection with a component, just like use state. All right, let's go and create another example application. We'll call this one native use reducer. And again, this is available to you in the GitHub repository associated with this video. And I'll bring it up in VS Code. Let's install it and then run it and bring it up in the browser. Okay, looks good. So let's pare this down again. Okay, we're all cleaned up. But before we get into use reducer, I do want to talk a little bit about a reducer function in general. And a good way to do that would be to open up a TypeScript workbook and look at the reduce method on an array. So let's give ourselves an array of numbers, and we want to total up those numbers. So let's start with a total, and then we'll iterate through all the numbers and then add that to the total. And eventually, well, what do we get? We get 60. 10 plus 20 plus 30, 60. I think that makes sense. All right, so another way to do that is to use a reducer function. So numbers has a function on it called reduce.
अहिले यस्तो भनेर कि यो चाहिँ के भन्यो भने एउटा सर्टेन एरिया छ भने यसको सब निकाल्नु पर्यो निकाल्नु पर्यो भने इटरेटिभ फङ्सन छ भने एउटा इटरेटिभ फङ्सन छ रिड्युस गर्ने जसले एक्युमुलेटेड भ्यालु प्लस करेन्ट भ्यालु दिन्छ यसमा एक्युमुलेटेड र करेन्ट भ्यालुलाई पठायो भने फर्स्ट एलिमेन्ट पठाउनुपर्छ सेकेन्ड एलिमेन्ट भनेको इनिसियल भ्यालु हो यहाँ 0 पठाइदिएको सिधै यहाँ 0 लेख्दिनु हुन्छ भेरिएबल के हुन्छ ऱ्याम्प डट रेडियसमा जहिले पनि डट रेडियसमा a, b हुन्छ a प्लस b गर्ने इनिसियल भ्यालु 0
And that reduce function takes two parameters. It takes a reducer function, which returns something, and then it takes an initial value. So our initial value here would be the same as this total. We start off at 0. So that's easy enough. So this reducer function takes two parameters. It takes the current value, which would be 0 to start, and then it takes the number at the given index as it indexes through the entire array. So it starts off at 20, 10, 20, and 30. So we'll call that n. And the output of a reducer is the new value for the next iteration. So in this case, we want to take the existing value, so starting at 0, and then add on each number as we go through. Now, if we look at this, we get 60 as the output. How cool is that? So this function right here that we pass to reduce is called the reducer, and it takes two parameters. It takes the current value, and then it takes some new value. In the case of numbers, because we're iterating through an array, it takes each one of the numbers as we go through. And then the output of a reducer is what the next iteration's input will be. So this reducer pattern is going to show up in two places in this video. It's going to show up in the use reducer example that we're going to build here. And it's also going to show up in Redux. So learning how reducers work is beneficial across state management. Okay, so what do we want to do with use reducer here? Well, we want to rebuild this example of a list of names and then an input name and build it all in one piece of state management. And so we'll bring in use reducer. and we'll invoke it. And the first thing let's decide on is what's going to be in the state. So the state is going to have a list of names, start off with an empty array, and then it's going to have the current name, piece of state management, and state management. Okay, so what do we want to do with use reducer here? Well, we want to rebuild this example of a list of names and then an input name and build it all in one piece of state management. And so we'll bring in use reducer and we'll invoke it. And the first thing let's decide on is what's going to be in the state. So the state is going to have a list of names, start off with an empty array, and then it's going to have the current name, which will just be an empty string. And that is going to be the state. So use reducer, just like use state, returns an array. That array has two elements to it. The first is the current state. So in this case, that would be this object here. And then it also returns a dispatch. And that's a way to invoke the reducer function that we're going to add. So let's create our reducer function. And the reducer function takes the existing state, which I'll just name state. And then it'll take some sort of action, right? And that's what's going to be sent to that dispatch. So we'll just call that action. So by convention, action is usually an object, and that object has a type on it. And then you use that type in the switch statement to then mutate that state and return a new state based on the data that you get with that. Action. So let's some sort of act is the current state. That is going to be the state. So use reducer, just like use state, returns an array. That array has two elements to it. The first is the current state. So in this case, that would be this object here. And then it also returns a dispatch. And that's a way to invoke the reducer function that we're going to add. So let's create our reducer function. And the reducer function takes the existing state, which I'll just name state. And then it'll take some sort of action, right? And that's what's going to be sent to that dispatch. So we'll just call that action. So by convention, action is usually an object, and that object has a the existing state, which I'll just name state. And then it'll take some sort of action, right? And that's what's going to be sent to that dispatch. So we'll just call that action. And that's what's going to be sent to that dispatch. So we'll just call that action. So by convention, action is usually an object, and that object has a type on it. And then you use that type in the switch statement to then mutate that state and return a new state based on. So by convention, action is usually an object, and that object has a type on it. And then you use that type in the switch statement to then mutate that state. Object has a type on it. Call that action. So by convention, action is usually an object, and that object has a type on it, and then you use that type in the switch statement to then mutate that state and return a new state based on the data that you get with that action. So let's just start with setting that name. So we'll create a switch statement, and we'll switch on a type, which comes in from that action. So when we dispatch, we're going to dispatch an object that has a type on it. And we'll switch on a type, which comes in from that action. So when we dispatch, we're going to dispatch an object that has a type on it. And then we'll create a case. And let's call this one set name, because our first thing is we want to be able to set that name for that input field. So let's do set name. And now we want to return a new version of state. So we take all of the existing state, and then we have a name that comes in on a key called pay. Payload. And that's kind of by another convention. You can really rename these keys all you want, but it's very common to see type and payload. So the second value that comes out of this array is dispatch, and we're going to use that when it comes to our input. So let's go create the input here. So we're going to have an input where the type is text, and the value is the name that comes out of here. So that right there, we get state, name, and that gives us go create the input here. So we're gonna have an input where the
के भन्नु छ भने तिमीले युज रेडियुसर कल गर्दाखेरि अहिलेसम्मको भ्यालु कहाँ छ तिम्रो स्टेटमा छ है अहिलेको भ्यालु के आएर नयाँ एड गरिदिँदा चाहिँ तिमीले एउटा भ्यालु पठाएनौ हैन तिमीले भ्यालु पठायौ नि तिमीले भ्यालु पठायौ हैन त्यो भ्यालुलाई चाहिँ एक्सन भनेको छ के एक्सन पठायो अब तिम्रो एक्सनलाई यसले हेर्छ एक्सन टाइप इक्वल्स टु हैन एक्सन डट टाइप छ हैन केसमा अपडेट नेम भन्ने भ्यालु पठाछ भने आउटपुट कसरी हुन्छ अपडेट रिटर्न गर्ने नि त्यहाँ पनि रिटर्न गरेर नि जोडेर त्यो के थियो तिमीले चाहिँ लेखेर पठाए पनि भयो यहाँ चाहिँ मैले पेलोड भने अर्को केस हुन सक्छ है यो चाहिँ यसको भयो हैन अब यसमा के थियो इनिशियल भ्यालु थियो नि त्यो इनिशियल भ्यालु नेम सो इनिशियल भ्यालु थियो मान्छेको नेम टन्नै थियो नेम चाहिँ स्ट्रिङ थियो अपडेट नेम रमेश देखिरहेको थियो जब मैले बटन थिच्छ सेट नेम गर्नु पऱ्यो रिटर्न names state dot names comma action dot payload last दामी use reducer भनेको भयो action भनेको त्यो भयो हैन dispatch ले चाहिँ भ्यालु बनाउँछ
type is text, and the value is the name. that comes out of here. So that right there, we get state name, and that gives us state.name. And then the on change.
अन्डा त त्यहाँ छ नि त नि अन्डा त त्यहाँ रहेछ नि त नि तिम्रो पहिला चाहिँ एरे डट थियो नि त रियुज रिड्युसरले चाहिँ यस्तो हो युज रिड्युसरले चाहिँ तिमीलाई त्यो प्रत्येक लुपमा हुने हो नि त त्यो चिज होइन प्रत्येक इटिरेट हुने हो नि त इटिरेटको एउटा चिज दियो कि त्यो एउटा चिज रन गर्नलाई तिमीलाई एउटा डिस्प्लेस दिएछ होइन डट नेक्स्ट गरे जस्तै तिमीले आफ्नो एउटा भ्यालु दियो पहिलेदेखि छ त्यहाँ होइन तिमीलाई जस्तो स्टेट छैन अनि त्यसपछि डिस्प्याच छ होइन अनि त्यसपछि युज रिड्युसर छ होइन युज रिड्युसर छ नि युज रिड्युसरले के गरेर पहिलो युज रिड्युसर छ होइन युज रिड्युसरले के लिन्छ स्टेट लिन्छ अर्को के लिन्छ एक्सन लिन्छ भने एक्सन भइसक्छ भ्यालु भन्छ तिमीले यो दिनु पर्दैन नि यो दिनु अलिकति फर्क तिमी यो दिनु पर्दैन यसले स्टेटले राखिरहेछ होइन बोर्डले राखिरहेछ आफ्नो स्टेट त मेन्टेन गरिरहेछ होइन एक्सन चाहिँ यो त छ एक्सन छैन यो चाहिँ रिड्युसर जस्तै बनाउनु खोज्यो इक्वल्स टु भनेर रिड्युसर चाहिँ जहिले पनि तिमीले आफ्नो स्टेट चाहिँ यहाँ दिइरहेछ ठिक छ यो दिइरहेछ अनि तिमीलाई अरू के एक्सनको ठाउँमा के दिएछ डिस्प्याच दिएछ डिस्प्याचमा तिमीले आफ्नो एक्सनको अब्जेक्ट पठाउने हो ठीक है constant state dispatch equals to use reducer नाम सेट गर्ने जब हो भने के गर्नु पर्यो
We are going to dispatch, and then we're going to give it an object. And that object is going to have a type. That type is going to be checked here. We're going to pass set name, and then we're going to give it a payload. And that payload is, again, that target value. So the target of the event is this input, and then .value is going to give you your current value. So let's take a look, see how we go. And you know what? Just to check it, let's go and add in a div where we output the current state name. All right. All right, there we go. Is this input?
Yeah.
And then dot value is going to give you your current value. So let's take a look, see how we go. And you know what? Just to check it, let's go and add in a div where we output the current state name. All right, let's have a look. Okay, so we've got input field over. It's actually happening on it. This reducer current is, and we're going to instead just return. Let's see what happens. Refresh, we type, and nothing happens. Reducer, and saying, hey, this map, yeah, refresh, we type, and return state. And we'll just set the name to that payload. Let's see what happens. Refresh, type, and nothing happens. And again, this is because React is looking at the reference that's coming out of useReducer and saying, hey, this matches the existing reference. So, but can't see. It's not going to compare by contents. It's not going to look at the inside the object and say, look, the name is different between these two things. It's going to look at the reference to the object. So that's why we have to create a new object here and then just mutate the fields that we want to mutate. So we return all of the existing fields, which mean all of names, and then we just override the key for name and change it to whatever's coming in off that payload. So now we need to allow for the customer to add an item to the array. So let's create a new case called all of the existing, this action. And I think actually also we should fields at the same time. It's pretty cool. There. So easy. That is, we can actually mutate multiple fields at the same time. It's pretty cool. All right, let's go down here and we will make a button out of this. Call this add name. And with that on-click handler, we will then dispatch add name. And you know what? Actually, we don't really even need a payload here because we already have the state. So let's go and just do add name. So this is going to be state.names. We already have just state.name there. Yeah, that makes more sense. Look. Add name. And now we don't really know. Maybe it added, maybe it didn't. See if we actually... Let's go and see what we have in that list of names to see if we actually added a name. So as you can see, I have a lot of data. User pull it out of the... You can imagine you would have, so in this case, we have an object that has 2 keys in it. You can imagine you would have an object that would have a lot of data in it, a lot of different keys. This would be a much nicer way to do that. And you could go and take this reducer, pull it out of the component code itself, and you could go and take this reducer, or pull it out of the component code itself, and then test it independently and not have to worry about testing it through a React component. So I think it's actually a really nice way if you have complex state to model that. All right, now one more trick I want to show you when it comes to use reducer. I really like this one. So let's go and call this name list. And then we'll make another app component. And we'll use name list in there. Okay, so we're going to go and make ourselves a little user form. And in here, we're going to have 2 input fields. First here, this name list. If you have complex state to model that. All right, now one more trick I want to show you when it comes to use reducer. I really like this one. So let's go and call this name list. And then we'll make another app component. And we'll use name list in there. Okay, so we're going to go and make ourselves a little user form. And in here, we're going to have 2 input fields, first and last name. So let's make a div. And then within that, we'll have an input type as text. And at this point, we'll just say that our value is going to be some state, state.first, and then we'll have state.last. Okay, so let's use a reducer for that. So we'll say use reducer. And we won't specify our reducer function quite yet. Let's go and set our initial state to have first and last. And then we'll get that state as well as a dispatch. All right, great. Okay, cool. So let's invoke user form here and see if it works. Nice. We have two fields there, but they don't do anything. So here's the trick, and I really love this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine the state, the existing state, with whatever comes in on the action. Just like that. It's so easy. In fact, actually, we can make it just a little bit easier. How cool is that? And now what we can do is over here in our onChange, we can just dispatch with whatever key we want to change. So we send first.
जब तिमीले एउटै गेम गर्नु छ भने एउटै गेम गर्नु छ भने केही पनि गर्नु परेन भइहाल्यो डिस्प्याच सिधै भेट्ला हो होइन जस्तो यसले यस्तो भनेको स्टेटमा तिम्रो फर्स्ट नेम र लास्ट नेम छ अरे होइन फर्स्ट नेम र लास्ट नेम छ अरे पेलोडमा किन भ्यालु पठाउने यार जे छ नाम फर्स्ट नवीन लास्ट और लोगेन सही पढ्नु स्टेट भनेको के छ First, right given you kill it. Action by given. Then we put here one.
first, then first overrides just first, but everything else remains the same. And the same with last. So we send first, then first overrides just first, but
okay. Action जब तिम्रो यो पठायो तिमीले तिमीसँग यही भ्यालु छ अपडेट भएन त नि भएन
everything else remains the same. And the same with last. So let's give this a try over on last. Prove it out. Let's go in. You don't have to have is state dot first.
हैन अनि फर्स्ट र लास्ट तक पठाउँछ नि यसले फर्स्ट पठाउँछ यसले लास्ट पठाउँछ के फर्स्ट त यसले पठाउँछ यसले अपडेट गर्न पाएन लास्ट पठाउँदा फर्स्ट हेरेको छ यो चाहिँ अपडेट
First, and we'll make a new div for last. Perfect. That's sweet. So you don't have to have a whole raft of state functions. Using this little pattern here, you can manage very easily large object state and make all the mutations that you want. It's a nice pattern when it comes to use reducer. All right, so next up, we're going to take a look at two ways to observe state: use callback and use memo. So now that we know how to declare state using use state and use reducer, let's talk about three hooks that allow you to monitor state. That would be use memo, use callback, and use effect. So now that we know how to declare state using use state and use reducer, let's talk about three hooks that allow you to monitor state.
मोनिटर स्टेट भन्नको मतलब चाहिँ चेन्ज भएको छ कि छैन भनेर हेर्छ क्या एउटा कुरा चाहिँ के हुन्छ नि युज कल ब्याक भनेको त्यो फङ्सन चाहिँ तब मात्र कल हुन्छ जब त्यो स्टेट चाहिँ चेन्ज भयो क्या त्यो स्टेट चाहिँ चेन्ज भएको छ
That would be use memo, use callback, and use effect. And it's actually the most simple.
युज कल ब्याक भनेको अब युज कल ब्याक भनेको चाहिँ त्यो फङ्सन चाहिँ कल हुन्छ रिरेन्डरमा कुरा हो रिरेन्डरमा युज इफेक्ट difference between use effect and use call use effect when के अरे फंक्शन चाहिँ के भनेको क्यास्ट भ्यालु हो जसले चाहिँ फङ्सनको रिफरेन्स चाहिँ स्टोर गर्दाखेरि त्यो रिफरेन्स चाहिँ तब चेन्ज हुन्छ जब यो भेरिएबल चेन्ज हुन्छ
yet somehow the most misunderstood. So I like to think of use memo as use calculated value. So let's take a simple example of a list of numbers. So here we've defined some state. We've got 10, 20, and 30 in there in our array, and we want to total it up. And in fact, if we want to use that nifty reducer pattern that will return the new accumulator, and then, but of course I need to say like, oh, every time. Okay, well, in memory, saying component twice. That's a React 18. Store the data, so we need a data for that selected.
यूज इफेक्टमा रिटर्न गरेको चाहिँ कम्पोनेन्ट अनबाउन्ड रहेछ नि त नि component did mount भइसकेपछि चाहिँ use effect component will unmount use effect मा return component did update भने component did update updated value भनेको use component did update भनेको component update भयो component update भयो भने re-render गर्ने नत्र नगर्ने अथवा त्यस्तो भने होला नि हैन component did catch component did update भने के हो component did unit is immediately after updating occurs updating भयो भने के previous property र previous state यो थियो this is not called for initial render previous property तिम्रो के थियो अहिलेको तिम्रो props के छ previous props अपडेट हुने बित्तिकै कम्पोनेन्ट डिड अब्जेक्ट कल हुन्छ क्या ए भनेको त यो त अनि युज अपडेट त यो त युज इफेक्ट त भन्छ नि यो कल हुन्छ भन्ने use this as an opportunity to operate on DOM when the component has been created. Also, good place to do network request allowing you to compare the current property previous. पहिलेको प्रपर्टी आउँछ दिस डट प्रोप्स आयो should component update भनेको
person. We'll call that selected name detail set stringify that. So we started before and all this use effect. Go and rerun this after interval code, probably minus and component. It doesn't. And now we want to set float application. It is one more way to called useRef. So we'll take a look at that.
Okay. I'll take a break. Not the break, but I'll drink some juice. I'm so tired. Use reference. There is one thing called a reference. There is another thing called context. Context is considered as one component. Another component inside it.
Okay, let's take a quick look at useRef.
Use ref export default use ref export default function export default function export default function use ref input use ref from React.
It is one more way to. Now, I mentioned early on that there was this other way of storing state.
स्टेट त आफैमा एउटा युज स्टेट भयो हैन, त्यो त आफैमा स्टेट छ हैन, अर्को पनि एउटा स्टेट छ, त्यसलाई हामीले के भन्छ रेफरेन्स भन्छ हैन,
In a component called useRef. So
युज रेफ. We'll look at that next.
we'll take a look at that next. Okay, let's take a quick look at useRef. It is one
Why quick?
more way to associate state with a component in React. The interesting thing about useRef, though, is that when you change the value of a reference, it doesn't actually cause a component re-render.
We want to re-render.
That when you change the value of a reference, it doesn't actually cause a component re-render. So that can be convenient in some cases. But there's actually two ways that folks use useRef. So let me show you when you change the value of a reference, it doesn't actually cause a component re-render. So that can be convenient in some cases. But there's actually two ways that folks use useRef. So let me show you the first way, the most common way, and then I'll show you about the state management side of it after that. Useref. So let me show you the first way, the most common way.
Use ref persist value between render. It is a mutable value that does not cause a re-render when updated. It can be used to access the DOM element directly. If we try to count how many times our application render using use state गऱ्यो भने त using use state use state whenever it renders यस्तो रेन्डर विचार भ्यालु स्टोर हुने स्टेटमा मात्रै हैन, स्टेटलाई तिमीले चेन्ज गर्नु बित्तिकै फेरि रेन्डर भइदिन्छ। तिमीलाई चाहिँ के हुनु पर्यो भने प्रत्येक स्टेट बिचमा भ्यालु चाहिँ स्टोर भएर बस्नु पर्यो त्यो होइन, त्यो चाहिँ स्टोर बिचमा भ्यालु स्टोर भएर बस्नु पर्यो। तर त्यो चेन्ज हुँदाखेरि चाहिँ रिरेन्डर भइदिन भएन कि स्टेट चेन्ज भयो जस्तै। युज इफेक्ट चाहिँ रेन्डरमा कल हुन्छ, रिरेन्डरमा कल हुँदैन। युज इफेक्ट रिरेन्डरमा कलै भयो। रिरेन्डरमा कहिले कलै हुँदैन नि। युज रेफ चाहिँ तिमीसँग युज रेफ हुक छ होइन, युज रेफ चाहिँ जसलाई अपडेट गर्दा रिरेन्डर हुँदैन भन्नु खोजेको। जस्तो कम्पोनेन्टको होस्, if we try to count how many render using, we would count in infinite loop. जस्तो तिमीले युज स्टेट गर्यो, इनपुट भ्यालु यस्तो छ भनेर युज रेफरेन्स भनेर भन्यो भने, युज स्टेटको ठाउँमा युज रेफरेन्स भन्यो भने काउन्ट आयो। ठिक छ, काउन्टमा अब यसलाई भेरिएबल जसरी चेन्ज गर्न पाइयो कि, एउटा भेरिएबल छ जुन स्टेट वाइज बाँचिरहन्छ क्या, त्यो हो युज रेफरेन्स। जुन चाहिँ बाँचिरहन्छ होइन, जस्तो अब प्रत्येकचोटि रेन्डर हुँदाखेरि प्रत्येकचोटि रिरेन्डर चाहिँ कसरी गर्छ ल भन त? Use effect without use effect मा त्यसको भेरिएबलले दिएन भने के फाइदा हुन्छ? Use effect without dependency अरे एउटा काम गरेर constraint count set count equals to use state 0 छ console dot log count गरेर त आउँछ
and then I'll show you about the state management side of it after that. About TypeScript, filter hook, our whole app in a query client provider. This is again to our app and bring it in. It stays in Jotai, simplifying stuff, simplifying functions that allow us to really easily create stores and slices. So get in, created our app.
Okay. Let me check what time is my interview tomorrow. Google Calendar. It's from 12. So I'm gonna stop this video now. I won't be able to finish it, and I have only like 10-15% of my energy left. So I just I'll use in something else. I'll just research about the position, and I don't know what is human resource manager. Let me check Gmail.
A little over these. What we're going to Cruise WebViz, our main AV data visualization tool, but also in other tools at Cruise, such as mapping and remote assistance. And WebViz is our AV specific product that can also be used.
our app is in the direct Pokemon based marathon to Game Manager we're going to take a look at is the venerable Rita.
Still live stream.
HLS was developed by Apple and stands for HTTP live streaming. It's the most widely used streaming protocol for playback today. In most live streaming workflows, an encoder will compress a live stream of video as H.264 and audio as AAC. This gets packaged using the RTMP protocol and audio as AAC. This gets packaged using the RTMP protocol and then sent to an edge server. The media server unpacks the RTMP stream and then repackages it as HLS. It can also transcode the stream into multiple bit rates for adaptive bitrate streaming. Then it sends the playlists and multiple streams to a content delivery network. From here, they're cached for faster distribution to players all over the world.
You encode
Now when a player wants
audio and video file, audio and video file, audio is encoded in AAC. Audio codec, video codec, and it is passed to the metastream server. Metastream server is
AAC. This gets packaged using the RTMP protocol
real-time message protocol mapping audio to video package and
then sent to an edge server. The media server unpacks the RTMP stream and then repackages it as HLS.
unpackage गर्छ अनि फेरि प्याकेज गर्छ प्याकेज गर्दा multiple bit stream
video before there was one of the large raced it very early on, right around technology. And if you pause video didn't stall because you didn't have enough multiple bit adaptive bit rate streaming workflow. This one assumes you're doing it live, and it starts with the camera over on the left, sends a signal, even as your bandwidth maybe a little backpack, not
how to stream point cloud data from Okay, guys. Bye bye. Good night for now. I think this video is going to end here. See you tomorrow. Have a good night or have a good day wherever you are.